More and more of us seem exhausted with humanity. People don't trust each other the way they used to. And after enough disappointment, many decide to only rely on themselves because they don't want to get hurt again. We live in a time of growing isolation, division, and cynicism. People have stopped expecting much from each other and the world altogether. And honestly, I understand why. When you look around, it's so easy to feel discouraged because sometimes it looks like greed is rewarded while kindness gets taken advantage of, and people willing to step on others somehow keep ending up on top. The world gives us plenty of reasons to become cynical and withdrawn. But have you thought about what happens if all the people who still have love in them choose to close their hearts too? If they decide one day that humanity is no longer worth believing in and showing up for, what if the answer is not about becoming closed off? What if it's about learning how to keep your heart open after you have every reason not to? Before we talk about staying open, I think we need to acknowledge why so many people close in the first place. And if you're empathic and highly sensitive, or someone who has spent a lot of your life caring about other people deeply, then you probably know this pattern very well. You spend a lot of your life absorbing other people's emotions and carrying burdens that never belonged to you. So boundaries were not optional. The problem is that some of us built the walls we needed to survive and we never leave them. And I say we because I've done this too. I know what it feels like to be repeatedly disappointed and let down by people you trusted. Because we come into this world wide open. We feel everything, we understand everyone, and maybe even excuse too much. We become so good at explaining other people's behavior, maybe sometimes we forget to ask if that behavior was even okay, because we see the wound behind it. We see fear behind the control and insecurities underneath the cynicism. And because we see it, usually we stay much longer than we should, because we genuinely see their humanity. Eventually, life teaches boundaries the hard way, usually through enough betrayal, disappointment, disrespect, that you finally learn that understanding someone doesn't require giving them access to you. You become more discerning, careful, selective. Maybe you stop people-pleasing or trying to save everyone. Or maybe you learned how to say no without explaining yourself. And for some time, it can really feel like healing. But healing doesn't stop there, because the walls you build to protect yourself from pain also protect you from life. And I don't say this from some love and light perspective, because I know exactly what it feels like to become protective and cut someone off and refuse to speak with them for 12 years. I had a best friend back home in Europe years ago. She was like family to me, like a sister I never had. We grew up together and she was one of the closest people in my life. And when you love someone like that, you don't sit there looking for signs that they might deceive or betray you. You just hope for the best, because your heart doesn't even know how to see the worst until the worst happens. And I won't go into details because that's not the point of the story. But it was not some teenage misunderstanding. It was a series of things said and done behind my back that eventually came to light. And I remember it felt like I swallowed a glass full of sharp iron nails. That's the closest I can describe the sensation. It was the kind of betrayal that changes not only the way you see a person, but the way you see the whole world. And I remember I confronted her and cut her off immediately. At that point, I could not even imagine repairing that friendship, which was so unlike me, because up until that point, I had always been the understanding one, the one who always tried to forgive, to see the good in people, and always find a way forward. But that time, I just couldn't. She tried to reach out through people, and mutual friends told me that she regretted what happened, and she asked to help persuade me to talk to her. But part of me just died in that connection, and I did not want to resurrect it. And maybe some of you know exactly what I mean. Sometimes people just say, just forgive, without realizing how much they're actually asking of you, because sometimes forgiveness feels like letting someone near the place where they already burned your house down once. So I understand why many open-hearted people become guarded. Why, after years of being disappointed, taken for granted, or hurt, you finally say, enough, I'm done. I'm protecting my peace and I'm choosing myself. And for many, learning to set up boundaries can feel like a miracle in the beginning. It's the first time you realize that love does not require self-abandonment, that being compassionate does not mean giving people unlimited access to you. You can finally see that just because you feel strongly about someone, it doesn't mean that you have to heal or save them. And after enough disappointment, betrayal, and all the situations when your kindness was not reciprocated, protection starts feeling like wisdom, like the only way to move through this world without ever getting hurt again. But the problem is that many of us mistaken that for the destination. We build a fortress, then call it healing. And I understand why, because fortress feels safe. After all, nobody can betray you if they cannot reach you. Nobody can disappoint you if they don't have access to you. And nobody can hurt you if they never get close enough. But the thing is that life cannot reach you either, and neither can connection. After a while, you stop noticing what the fortress is costing you. Because there is a difference between boundaries that protect your heart and walls that bury it. And there is a difference between discernment and waiting for people to confirm the worst thing that you already suspect about them. And the hardest part is that we genuinely think that we're protecting ourselves. But if everyone who has previously been hurt before only learns how to protect themselves, then what happens? What happens when enough good people stop trusting at all? When enough loving people completely withdraw, and when enough caring people decide that the world is no longer worth opening their hearts to? That's why I think boundaries are not the final destination. I think that they're the bridge, because eventually the lesson stops being just boundaries and starts becoming grace. Not the kind of grace that tolerates mistreatment and keeps giving people access to places they've already damaged. Because grace without boundaries becomes self-abandonment. And boundaries without grace eventually lead to isolation. So the real challenge here is to learn how to hold both at the same time. For me, this is what integrated empathy looks like. It's neither blind openness nor emotional armor, but open-hearted discernment. It's no longer a fortress built to keep everyone out. It is a garden with a gate protecting something valuable. The garden is still alive, open to the world. It's still open to growth and real connection. But there is a gate now, and you're the gatekeeper. If someone doesn't appreciate what the garden offers or repeatedly brings manipulation, disrespect, or harm into it, the gate closes firmly without any hatred or revenge, simply because protecting the garden is your responsibility now. At the same time, not everyone who hurts us is evil. Many people are acting unconsciously from their wounds that they have not healed yet. Understanding this does not mean that you should stay and tolerate their behavior like a martyr. It just means to refuse carrying bitterness where discernment would do. And I know how uncomfortable it can feel because it requires conscious vulnerability. Because once you've worked so hard on building your boundaries, it can seem risky to open your heart again. Part of you might be wondering if you end up repeating the same lessons if you let your guard down and lose all the progress you've made. But what if openness and discernment aren't the opposites? Maybe the goal has never been to become harder. Maybe it was to become wise enough to stay open without abandoning yourself. Because I don't think that the most emotionally mature person in the room is the one who has built the highest walls. I think it's the one who no longer depends on them to feel safe, because they have learned to trust themselves enough to know when to close the gate when necessary. 12 years after that friendship ended, she found me again. By that point, she had moved to New York and I was living in Chicago. And this time I responded. And she flew to Chicago to talk. And that was the first time that we sat down face to face and spoke honestly about what happened and why. And what struck me the most was that she took full responsibility for what she had done. She did not try to justify or rewrite anything to make her look better. She told me that she had carried guilt about it all these years and that what happened had changed her. And I believed that because I could feel that she meant it. What I discovered that day was that forgiveness turned out to be something completely different from what I thought it was when I was younger. It is not the same as reconciliation. It does not automatically rebuild trust or restore a relationship. And it does not give people the same level of access to your life that they once had. Sometimes people still have a place in your heart, but they no longer have a place in your life. And these are two different things. Forgiveness simply means I choose to extend grace instead of resentment and release you from the debt between us. And I also release myself from the prison I built around pain. This way, grace is not letting someone continue hurting you in the name of being more spiritually mature. It is the ability to not become what hurt you. I think the reason why grace can feel so threatening is because it asks us to stop using our pain as identity and stop organizing our lives around our wounds. And this is so hard because after you've been hurt enough, your pain starts giving you the rules. Don't trust anyone. Never need anyone. Never be the first one to reach out. Never forgive too quickly. And never let people see how deeply you care. The problem is that sometimes it's just fear disguised as wisdom. So at some point, you have to honestly ask yourself, am I truly living from wisdom or am I living from my wounds? Am I protecting my peace or am I protecting my pain? Eventually, these questions become spiritual, not just psychological ones. And that's what brings me to Christ consciousness. It's not about performing goodness or pretending to be above any human emotion. To me, it's the embodiment of forgiveness, mercy, truth, strength without cruelty, and love without ego. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 39, Jesus says that if someone slaps you on one cheek, turn the other also. And I know how it may sound at first, especially if you've been repeatedly disappointed, let down, betrayed, or abused. It may sound like let people hurt you, walk all over you, not protect yourself, and have no boundaries. But I don't think that that's the deeper meaning. I think it points to a level of inner freedom where another person's behavior does not get to determine the state of your soul. You do not become hateful just because someone hated you. And you do not become cruel just because someone was cruel to you. You do not abandon your own heart just because someone else didn't know how to hold it. Instead, you break the cycle of retaliation. You simply refuse to spread evil by passing your pain to the next person just because someone passed theirs. And you choose to trust God or the higher power that He sees what happened, even if justice does not arrive on your timeline. It is not weakness. It's a different kind of strength. Maybe you're sitting there thinking, that is nice, but the world doesn't actually work that way. And I get it. Sometimes I look around and I see the same things that everyone else sees. People hurting, using each other, chasing power, control, money, and status. There are days when it looks like greed is rewarded and kindness is punished. And it is easy and tempting to say that it's just part of human nature. But most of the problems we complain about in society do not actually start in society. They begin much earlier. Think about it. Most people are not born that way. And they also do not wake up at 30 years old and suddenly deciding to become egotistical, controlling, manipulative, power-hungry, emotionally unavailable, and incapable of intimacy. No, it usually happens in the childhood wounds that were never addressed and the early strategies that we have learned to survive. The problem is that those strategies do not disappear just because we get older. They scale and we bring them with us into our relationships, workplaces, families, marriages, cultures, and positions of leadership. And eventually we end up building entire systems through the lens of what remains unresolved inside us. That's why I've always found it strange that we talk about fixing society as though society exists separately from the people creating it. It doesn't. Every institution, government, community, company is made up of human beings carrying fears, wounds, insecurities, blind spots, and unresolved pain. And those things don't just disappear because someone acquires power or authority. and then we act surprised, then those dynamics show up at larger scales. But what surprises me personally is that we expect wounded people to build healthy systems without addressing what wounded them in the first place. The world we live in is not separate from inner lives of the people building it. And a lot of what we call collective dysfunction is just unhealed inner dysfunction with power. This is why healing matters. I'm not saying that we're all supposed to spend the rest of our lives analyzing our childhoods. I'm saying that if we do not address what shaped us, then we pass it on to our children, marriages, leadership, businesses, entire systems. And then people ask, why is the world so cruel? Maybe because too many people had to become cruel to survive, because they never learned what to do with their pain and they just made other people carry it. Or maybe because generations of wounded people kept building wounded systems and calling them normal. And if that's the case, then healing is no longer just a personal matter. And if healing scales the same way trauma does, then every act matters. Every time someone chooses understanding instead of humiliation, chooses forgiveness instead of revenge, or refuses to become cynical despite having all the reasons to, then maybe the world changes for the better a little bit. Because enough acts eventually become culture, and culture becomes the world we live in. Yes, I care about the world deeply, precisely because I've seen what happens when people stop caring. But I don't believe that we heal the world only by yelling at the symptoms downstream. At some point, we have to get to the root, and the root is the human heart. I know this may sound idealistic. Maybe it is, but I would much rather be idealistic about humanity than cynical about it. Because cynicism is easy. Literally anyone can look at the world today and say, everything is broken, people are awful, no one cares, protect yourself and stay low. And honestly, some days I get that. But I don't want to build my entire life around the worst evidence. Why let the most wounded people decide how open our hearts are allowed to be? Yes, I understand the temptation to give up. And I understand why someone who has been hurt enough times would decide that they're done. But if we only get this one brief life, I would rather keep building something beautiful than spend the entire life in the fortress documenting everything that's been broken and just waiting for the end. I would rather risk disappointment than make cynicism my worldview, and I would much rather contribute to the kind of world I wish existed than surrender it to the people who have forgotten how to care. I just don't believe that the future belongs to the people who stop believing in humanity. I think it belongs to the people who have seen the darkness clearly and still refuse to abandon the light. The people who had every reason to close their hearts, but they chose not to, who refuse to allow disappointment make them smaller than they were meant to be. If everyone who still has love in them goes into hiding, then who is left to build something better? If kind, empathic people who still care about the world deeply withdraw completely, if people stop trying and decide that the world is not worth touching anymore, then the world doesn't become safer. It becomes colder. If you've been hurt because your heart was open before you knew how to protect it, I understand why you built the walls. You probably needed them. But what if they were never meant to be a permanent address? What if they were just a scaffolding, something that helped you rebuild what had been damaged? So maybe the real question isn't whether you learn how to protect yourself. Maybe the question is, what happens after that? Can you see people clearly without assuming the worst? Can you understand someone's wounds without making yourself responsible for healing them? And can you remain soft in the world that taught you that softness was dangerous? Because every time a person heals without becoming cynical, then the world gets a little warmer. Every time someone chooses discernment instead of bitterness, then one less wound gets passed down. And every time someone keeps their heart open without abandoning themselves, then something good survives. And maybe that's what healing was pointing toward all along, that it's neither innocence nor armor. It's becoming strong enough to stay open, strong enough to remain human.